that that Somalia is in arrears with the IMF and the World Bank restricts access to vital sources of recovery funding. Now, I fully recognise that debt relief and debt reduction is never a straightforward operation, and that there are complex issues involved. The bottom line here, though, is that it is wrong to place on the shoulders of Somalia's children responsibility for a debt which was built on the basis of extravagant borrowing and reckless lending. The debt needs to be written off, and I very much hope in the course of the discussions today this urgent challenge will be taken up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could I now invite the Somaliya NGO Consortium?
Mr. President, Secretary of State, Mr. Secretary General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as a representative body representing more than 80 local and international NGOs working in Somalia, I would like to take this opportunity to continue to highlight the critical role played by NGOs in this humanitarian response. I have said it before and I say it again. The humanitarian response plan that you have on your table, produced by UN OCHA, identifies over 300 operational humanitarian partners involved in the response. Your Excellencies, over 90% of these are NGOs. We are frontline responders, ready to take risks that no other actors want to take. That comes with its challenges. Since the beginning of the year, we are faced with 30 security incidents involving humanitarian workers in the first 3 months. In March alone, 35 security incidents. 13 aid workers have been abducted since the beginning of the year, all of whom thankfully have been released. Most of these are Somalis, and they are Somali's real humanitarian heroes. But the risks are even higher for people that are being displaced by the drought. People like Saadia, a 4-year-old girl living in an IDP camp. While she was playing outside her makeshift home, Saadia was sent by her mom to her neighbors to borrow some tea leaves. When she reached the neighbor's hut, she was raped by a 40-year-old man. Saadia's life has changed forever, and the perpetrators of sexual and gender-based violence continue to live in impunity in Somalia. As the Secretary General already mentioned, protection threats escalate with drought and population movements. Our President has already mentioned that since November, 600,000 people have fled or have moved. This is 3,000 people a day in Somalia that are forced to abandon their homes in search of water and food. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the UN Secretary General. Mr. Secretary General, the NGOs working in Somalia sent you a letter asking you to raise the profile of the humanitarian situation in Somalia. 1 week later, you were in Somalia. Thank you for that. It is imperative that the focus is on the humanitarian response and averting a famine, and that armed conflict is not escalated in the current environment. Military offensive will not only make it harder for people to be reached, but also create more displacement. We strongly believe as NGOs that the verge of a famine is not a good time to start a military offensive. Secretary of State, in your eloquent speech, you talked about humanitarian reform, and I want to speak on behalf of our local NGO members. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind the international community of the commitments just made over 1 year ago at the World Humanitarian Summit, particularly on the pledge to invest in local capacities through direct and predictable funding, where possible to national and local actors, along with long-term support to develop their capacity to prevent, respond, and recover from crisis. There is no better time than now to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now have a number of representatives that have indicated they'd like to speak. And again, in the interest of time, I'd like some short interventions. I'm now going to invite High Representative Vice President Federica Mogherini to speak on behalf of the European Union. Thank you, Federica.
Thank you very much, and thank to you and to the Secretary General of the United Nations for convening this meeting, and also for having this focus on humanitarian. Just a few weeks ago in Brussels, we gathered some of the key partners and donors that are around this table here, exactly to focus on how, also with Stephen, how we can step up our humanitarian support facing the risk of famine now. And the European Union, as you know well, is by far the first donor for Somalia in all different sectors. When it comes to our response to the drought, it amounts to over 460 million euros. And still we know that this is not enough, that we need to mobilize more resources. We will do our part, we will continue to do our part, but we need others to come in and increase the level of support. If we want to avoid the catastrophe. We believe also that the availability of resources is not the only challenge we are facing in Somalia when it comes to the risk of famine, insecurity, access constraints. Extortions of aid are among the biggest obstacles to deliver aid to the most needy. And restricted access remain for us the major impediment to roll out a full relief operation covering the majority of the needs. We also have a concern about the feasibility of the return process of up to 50,000 Somali refugees living in Kenya refugee camps now in the current context of severe drought. Beyond human suffering, we believe it is important, as the Secretary General mentioned, to contain the political risks. We are in a delicate moment for the institutions, the government, very much absorbed by the impact of the drought in the moment when it starts its process, only a few months after the inauguration of the President. We believe it is essential that we support and help the government to be seen delivering on expectations of the population and remain focused on also the other critical political and security challenges the population needs to find answers to, because they are somehow interrelated. Two last things. One is the regional dimension. We're focusing on Somalia here, but also because assisting Somalia in this moment also means assisting the neighbors, to limit spillover, but each country in the region, and in particular Ethiopia and Kenya, deserves specific attention and support. We should not forget it. And last but not least, we need to take climate change more seriously. This is true in general political terms. I discussed this in the UN, also with the Secretary General in the last days, but also in our projections for the region. Second, last, only stability and development can create an environment in which natural disasters can be coped with. And this is why the rest of the conference today will be also so important. I thank you.
Federica, thank you for your contribution. Can I now invite the German Minister, followed by the Canadian Immigration Minister? Thank you.
Thank you very much. 10 days ago I was in Somalia, and I saw tired and distressed people in Badoya camp. I never saw such a horrible situation, and Antonio Guterres knows that very well. I visited a lot of refugee camps during my political career, but I never saw such a disastrous situation like in Badoya camp. They had lost everything in the drought, their crops, their livestock, their access to water. More than 600,000 people have been forced to leave their homes in search of food and water since November last year. Their suffering must stop. And that is why we are here to meet today, and I'm personally very thankful for the initiative of United Kingdom to invite not only to the security issue in the following conference, but also to a pledging conference here. In April in Berlin, we issued the Berlin humanitarian call for our countries standing united against famine to mobilize even more support, but more needs to be done. We need more humanitarian assistance, more and better humanitarian access, more stabilization and development support, and more action to facilitate political solutions and to prevent the crisis from happening. 2 weeks ago, we pledged our support to the humanitarian response in Yemen, and today we need to do the same for Somalia. I'm happy to say that our concerted efforts are bearing fruit. The humanitarian appeal for Somalia from the United Nations and the Secretary General is almost, I think, 55%. Unfortunately, that is not enough, as the needs continue to rise, so we must continue our efforts. Germany is providing substantial additional funding for the 4 crises in focus, bringing our total support nearly to 500 million euros in 2017 alone. Humanitarian assistance for the Somalia crisis will come up to 140 million euros. We started 2 years ago with 6 million and then nearly 40 million, and now we will raise 140 million for 2017. So we tripled our efforts for humanitarian aid for this crisis. But humanitarian assistance on its own will not advance political solutions or stimulate development. The countries themselves need to work towards overcoming the violence. They need to work towards political agreements. Droughts hit the Horn of Africa regularly, but if countries are at war, crisis can easily escalate. Together we can translate the 4 mores into specific action, and together we must live up to our joint responsibility to prevent a catastrophe. We owe this to the people of Baidoa, in Borno, in Wau, in Hodeida, and to all others seeking assistance. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary of State Patel, President Farmajo, and Secretary General Guterres for convening this important conference. I'm very privileged to be here to represent Canada and to be among friends and partners. Decades of conflict and insecurity have obviously devastated Somalia, destroying infrastructure and forcing millions of people from their homes. And today Somalia remains at the heart of the most dire humanitarian crisis. We are certainly facing a severe drought that is leaving millions of Somalis food insecure and on the brink of famine. And as friends and partners of Somalia, the international community cannot stand by and let history repeat itself from what we saw in 2011. And I can assure you that Canada has and will continue to do its part to help. Since 2016, we have provided more than $27 million in humanitarian assistance to help provide vulnerable Somalis with food, water and sanitation, healthcare and other humanitarian interventions. Our recent announcement of $119.25 million to address food insecurity in Nigeria, Yemen, Somalia and South Sudan included a portion of $21 million for Somalia. Of course, the impact of the humanitarian crisis in Somalia is not limited to its borders, and around 1 million Somalis are living as refugees in neighboring countries. And so we want to take this opportunity as Canada to recognize and appreciate the generosity of the governments in the region that continue to host large numbers of Somali refugees for so many years. Canada is doing its part in that area as well, and we have historically resettled many Somali refugees, both through our government resettlement plan for refugees, but also including our privately sponsored refugees by ordinary Canadians and by community organizations and religious groups. We will continue to provide much needed funding, critical funding to the UNHCR and the World Food Programme to assist Somali refugees in the broader region. Cyclical drought will no doubt continue. Climate change is a real factor. But to lessen the impact of future droughts or other crises, we're working very closely with multilateral and NGO partners to build households and build resilience, making sure that community resilience is at the heart of our response in addition to dealing with the immediate needs. For example, Canada has now provided our NGO partners in Somalia with the opportunity to access multi-year funding so that they can have stable, long-term and predictable funding so that they can design interventions that both meet our immediate humanitarian needs to intervene and also to address the long-term resilience challenge. Friends and colleagues, we are also reminded that when it comes to drought and famine and conflict, we recognize in Canada that these issues have a disproportionate impact on women and girls. And that is why our international development and assistance framework is focusing on women and girls. As we look forward to our humanitarian and longer-term responses, we must ensure that these address the particular needs of women and girls in Somalia. And as long as it is required, Canada will continue to seek ways to assist the most vulnerable, including the sick, children, and the elderly. The people of Somalia deserve no less. Canada has been and always has been and will be and continue to be on the side of Somalia and do so in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Could I invite ministerial colleagues in the following order, please, for Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, followed by Japan, to make their contributions.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Madam Secretary of State. First of all, thank you for bringing us together here today to discuss what I think is an issue which is on the minds of all of us. Now, in response to the drought and the warning of famine, Denmark has stepped up humanitarian support to Somalia. In 2017 alone, Denmark has already contributed with more than $20 million of exceptional humanitarian drought funding to Somalia, already approximately 40% our levels in 2016. And we will, of course, carefully review the new revised humanitarian response plan. I should add that this comes on top of our contribution via the European Commission, our contributions to the SURF, and of course our core contributions to a number of humanitarian agencies, be the UN or be the international. I think, as some of you have hinted at, I think one thing, of course, are the funds, but another thing is, of course, making sure that the assistance is delivered. And we are concerned about, as I think we all are, the lack of access to vulnerable population groups. And we urge the government to coordinate with UN and the rest to remove those constraints that can be removed and which are impacting on the delivery of assistance. At the same time, we think it's very positive to see that the government, the private sector in Somalia, and local organizations in Somalia and the international community has launched what is a large-scale response to the drought. But as others have alluded to, emergency relief is, of course, only a band-aid, if you like, without longer-term development efforts aimed at building resilience. Nationally sustained preparedness and response through national drought committees and localized action is key. Now, a week ago today, I stood in Mogadishu, and to me it was clear that the establishment of the drought operations coordination centers in Mogadishu, Baidoa, and Garowe are indeed improving operational coordination. But we must move beyond just coordination. We must bring development and humanitarian actors together in line with, as our colleague from the Somali NGO Consortium said, the promises we made at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul. This will be absolutely key to deal with the drivers and the consequences of the displacement we are seeing. We need to deliver in a coherent manner and to include INGOs, but also and not least local actors that are indispensable to ongoing efforts in Somalia and often have access where others have not. As we respond to the drought, we must embark, as the Secretary General said, on a new way of working towards the joint objective of meeting short and long-term needs of vulnerable people, aiming for collective results. And in this case, it is a drought-resilient Somalia which is better equipped to handle the next time a drought sets in. As I said, joint coherent engagement in Somalia is needed to address both the short-term and the longer-term needs and to contribute to building that resilience. As others have said, what we need to do is, of course, to save lives, but we also need to same time to help the Somalia build a future for itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State, and thank you, UK, UN, and not least the government of Somalia for bringing us together here. Much has been said already, and we are, of course, like others, gravely concerned about the situation caused by the drought in Somalia. and the devastating impact that it has and will have, not only for the lives and livelihoods, but actually for the whole region. And therefore it's a great concern. It's a concern of humanitarian support, but it's also a concern, and this has been said by several, of how we really can support the long-term development plan of Somalia and see to that security is also being brought for that matter. I think the new Somali administration has made it very clear here today, and we can also hear that it is actually seen on the ground that avoiding famine has been made a top priority, and of course we must support this action. And this is also what we promised with the grand bargain, to see to that we really support local ownership, because that's the way that we will have sustainable development with this regard. But then coordination amongst us is so important, therefore it's very good that we meet here today. And of course our financial response and the call need to be met with robust and long-term support to contribute to drought mitigation, but also to development and resilience. The Somali response, not least by the diaspora, but also by all the local NGOs, has been very impressive, and that is very promising. And I think that we have learned from the crisis that we have seen before, and that we are actually starting to provide better and more efficient aid. But we need to bear in mind that we really need to see that this is a long-term project, and that we will most probably see more droughts coming onwards. And we also stress the importance of the climate change implications that cause and will cause onwards more challenges to this region. We need to be proactive instead of reactive in the face of drought and crisis. And not least with what we will see onwards with the expected Niños, with floods and drought that will come with closer periods. Resilience mechanisms have been eroded, and the stability of the region is weak, and therefore, and this has been said several times, resilience building with the Somali people and the support for that is our top priority when we continue to mobilize high levels of resources for recovery. In order to ensure resilience, investments need to be made in long-term projects with regard to water infrastructure, mechanisms for disasters, social safety nets has also been mentioned, risk mitigation, and also agricultural diversification and adaptation. We need to support the improvement of the government and the national agency capacity for disaster management and support your efforts that you have already started. The new Ministry for Humanitarian Affairs is, of course, an important step that we will support with capacity building. And we think that there is also need to see the technical agency for disaster management. Of course, the coordination of the UN system is crucial, and therefore we're happy to see that this is also being done with the Drought Operations Coordination Center. It's a very welcomed initiative by us. And Sweden has also, as many in this room, front-loaded support to humanitarian actors within the UN family, but also others. The result of humanitarian and development support will be much more successful when humanitarian and development actors start to plan together. The analysis needs to be made that way to bring more efficient support. And once again, this is what we decided upon based on long-term experiences in the Humanitarian Summit. We need credit schemes, we need to support saving groups and market infrastructures, and also skills development from the start. Sweden has made efforts in engaging our development partners on the ground to see how we can prove and be a good example of how to close the gap between humanitarian and development support. Because we also recognize that even though we see a response, the humanitarian resources will not be enough on a long-term basis to cover the needs of the crisis and the life-saving activities. So therefore, closing the gap between humanitarian and development support is so important. We have not only front-loaded support to the UN and the humanitarian system, but we have also reprogrammed and added funds to existing development programs in Somalia to see to that they can be used for drought mitigation. But whilst we do this, and while we see the importance of common analysis and action between humanitarian and development partners, we also need to safeguard the specific mandate by the humanitarian actors. And of course, as was also said by Denmark, have the support from the Somali government to see to that there is access for the humanitarian action needed. We have managed to scale up our development programs to work with mitigation infrastructure, cash for work, livestock, livelihoods, resilience for an additional of $6.5 million. And for this year, we have doubled our effort in Somalia, which brings our response to $29 million directly to Somalia if we don't count the support to the humanitarian actors in the multilateral system. We, of course, applaud what we can also see, having a lot of Somali Swedes, the engagement from the diaspora and the Somali citizens to front the situation. We think that this is very, very promising for the future, and it, of course, also is very promising that we see closer ties between our countries. Because, of course, any crisis should be led by a country, and we are the ones to support. It's important also, finally, to highlight that the drought crisis is also creating regional challenges. I said this initially, and this must be reflected in our response. Refugee flows have not yet peaked, and we have to work together to safeguard a plan and asylum spaces in the neighboring countries. And IGAD has made great advances in putting durable solutions for displaced and drought response on the regional political agenda, which is something that we need to support and follow. Responses to these ills cannot and will not know borders. Drought is somewhat a national phenomenon, but closely linked to the concerns that we have on climate change. And Sweden has engaged in the link between security, climate change, and development. And the humanitarian disasters that we will see onwards will relate to the way we work with these links. We are gathered here today to look into political and security arrangements in Somalia. We all know how important these are, so we will also be very interested to follow the discussion onwards today and to see how we, with these linkages, can actually support Somalia in the best way.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Could I ask for everyone's indulgence now? We have less than 10 minutes and I have still 6 speakers. So I'm going to, in the following order, ask Switzerland, Japan, US, Djibouti, the World Bank, and then OIC. But as I've said, we have very, very short time. So could I have very short interventions, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I'll be brief. Switzerland and Denmark have co-chaired the humanitarian donor group Somalia for 1 year and are therefore very closely following up on the drought situation and the response to it. It has started to rain in Somalia, but not in all parts of the country, and the severe crisis is definitely not yet averted. Water levels remain critical, and the next weeks will be decisive for the growth of pasture and for the harvest to come in July. Coordination, which is key for an effective response, has improved, including in the regions. In this respect, donors have a responsibility to make sure that they continue to encourage coordination and cooperation among all stakeholders. Wherever possible, targeted cash-based interventions should remain a priority modality of intervention for markets to continue to function. In addressing the large-scale displacement
Hello everyone,
of
I'm General
agropastoralists
Nasir,
and
I'm a
pastoralist
YouTube
communities,
blogger.
restoring their livelihoods should now be a priority to avoid further destitution, protracted displacement situations, and eventually humanitarian aid dependency. Humanitarian access to some of the most affected regions remains a major challenge. Yes, there are serious security constraints, but we also hear about continued serious administrative impediments. And we would hence like to take this opportunity to call upon all stakeholders to do their utmost to ensure that aid can be delivered, and it is delivered based on the fundamental humanitarian principles of humanity, independence, neutrality and impartiality for it to reach those in need. As we speak, Somalia continues to face a major humanitarian crisis. In such a context, any large-scale military intervention would seriously affect the capacity of humanitarian actors to effectively respond to the current crisis and increase humanitarian suffering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry to speak in Japanese. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Shunsuke Takei, Parliamentary Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, attending today's conference as the representative of the Japanese government. I would like to express my respect for the initiative shown by our host of this event, UN Secretary General Guterres, President Farmajo, and International Development Secretary Patel, in holding this conference at this most important time. Japan is strongly concerned about the current situation in Somalia, where the humanitarian situation is further becoming lengthened and complicated by famine caused by drought and accompanying infectious diseases. The international community, including Japan, has gathered for this conference to push forward Somalia's economic and social development. To respond to the humanitarian crisis caused by conflicts and droughts that bring Somalia's own efforts and the international community's effort to nothing. Development cooperation that contribute to resolving the root cause as well as rapid humanitarian assistance is necessary. To hold back the expansion of the humanitarian crisis by famine, which the Horn of Africa, including Somalia and part of the Middle East, is facing, in March this year, Japan has decided $26 million of assistance, including $8.5 million to Somalia. I hope that this assistance will get across to suffering populations rapidly and effectively. Also, I think it is important for Somalia to strengthen its resilience to these crises and to upgrade its capacity for the prevention of the expansion of damages. Japan, together with the international community, will continue to respond to humanitarian crisis and to encourage Somalia's self-effort, including capacity building. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The United States government first and foremost commends the leadership of President Farmajo and his administration in responding to the drought. These efforts to facilitate and channel assistance from the private sector and the diaspora are extraordinary. The United States remains deeply concerned about the potential for famine in Somalia, and we're committed to working with the Somali government, other donors, the UN and NGO partners to prevent a famine. We tracked the early warning information very closely and acted early alongside Somalia and other donors by front-loading our response to the crisis to mitigate the likelihood of famine. The U.S. is the single largest bilateral donor of humanitarian assistance to the Somali people, providing nearly $364 million in humanitarian assistance since October 2015. We commend all of our donor partners, and we note the particular generosity of the United Kingdom, Germany, and the European Union for their significant increases in support for the current crisis. And we salute those who are risking their safety and their lives to deliver assistance. In addition to direct humanitarian assistance response, the U.S. government is adapting our development programming to support the humanitarian response to the drought, while also investing in community resilience. We continue to help support Somali refugees in Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda until they can return home safely and voluntarily. In restating our own commitment, the U.S. will continue to encourage Somalia's international partners to not only increase their support for the current crisis, especially in light of the revised UN appeal, but also to invest in Somalia's long-term resilience and recovery to ensure that this situation never happens again. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Skazata. I don't think there's a translation from French, so I have to... There is? Ce serait plus facile pour moi de parler français.
Allez-y.
Merci.
Madame la secrétaire d'État, Monsieur le Premier ministre, Mesdames et Messieurs honorables, je suis très heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui pour représenter le gouvernement de la République de Djibouti. Je voulais d'abord féliciter le gouvernement du Royaume-Uni de cette initiative très importante et saluer tous les efforts de la communauté internationale, à commencer par les Nations Unies, avec le secrétaire général des Nations Unies qui s'est rendu sur place il y a longtemps, ainsi que les ONG qui œuvrent.
Also the NGOs which are active on the ground. I would like to remind you of the fact that the droughts that impact Somalia is a regional drought, but plus constant terrorist risk. It's even more complex, and therefore the international community has to be active on the ground. The government does its best, we do our best to be on the front line and to bring our own contribution. We send on the spot the right means from the first day of that drought. And with the support of the Somali government. And we're putting our means at disposal not merely to help and support the victims of that drought in Somalia, but also to support people who are fleeing that crisis in Somalia, but also people from the Yemen region who are the victims of that drought and also poverty. And our government is ready to support all this and play its part to support Somalia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, let me also echo my congratulations to the conveners and also my respect and admiration for the implementers on the ground who are working to deliver this assistance in difficult circumstances. Now, I just want to say two things. One is that I'm delighted that the focus of this response is not only the immediate needs, but the recovery and also breaking the cycle of vulnerability in Somalia, particularly given that climate factors are likely to make these events more frequent in the future. So getting that recovery right is critical. I wanted to respond to the point made by the representative from Save the Children, that indeed there are significant resources available within the World Bank's IDA, to which many governments here today, if not most governments here today, are contributors, and you gave a very generous replenishment to IDA last December. But these could be available to Somalia if they were able to get through their debt relief process. Now that will be discussed at lunchtime today, and it will require some technical steps, but most of all political momentum. And I hope that creditors are able to, out of this conference, take away that momentum and get that moving. Even before we have a debt relief process, while Somalia is still in arrears to the bank, we will be requesting our board for an exceptional allocation from the crisis response window for Somalia of 50 million, which we look to disperse as quickly as possible to bridge that humanitarian development gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I'll be very brief. I want to thank you for your leadership in dealing with the situation in Somalia, and also thank the UN Secretary General and the UN system in this regard. We remained in Somalia in 2011 when many of our partners had to leave for security reasons, because we have a much higher level of tolerance in relation to risks regarding security, and we will continue to work hard in support of the people of Somalia, like many of our colleagues said, not only for the current crisis, but in the long term. I have to say that our member states have been very generous in supporting Somalia, and they will continue to do so. Since none of the OIC member states have spoken, I just wanted to say that Saudi Arabia has been one of the most generous contributors in support of Somalia. They have paid hundreds of millions of dollars in their support. So was Turkey, that built the airport, a hospital, and a number of roads that allow us to go to Somalia even today. And many others, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, and countries that have limited resources even, like Egypt, Djibouti, and others. So we hope to continue to support Somalia, and we thank you very much for holding this important event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because we are now really up against it on the clock, I'm going to close this session. And I really want to just give my sincere gratitude and thanks for everyone for their perseverance on timings. But I think importantly for the contributions that we have heard, for the resilience I think all donors have shown as well in terms of the extent of the challenge that we all face, but also the long-term commitment that we are giving today here for Somalia as well. I look forward to working with you throughout the day, but importantly, beyond this conference as well, on tackling this very, very difficult, challenging situation. So thank you again.